Hi everyone, this video is about tips on how to photograph spring flowers. Now spring is coming, especially here in the Netherlands. The temperatures are up and well, I see a lot of little flowers everywhere. So I figured it's time for a video on how to photograph these little spring flowers. Gonna give you lots of tips. Hopefully it's useful for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Tip number one, you can really find these little spring flowers everywhere. You don't need to visit a specific big garden for them. No, often you can find them right next to the road. So let me show you some examples. Here are some little snowdrops that I literally photographed right next to my house. You can see the cars, you can see the street lights. Doesn't matter if you get the right angle, they just look very beautiful. Also these poppies here, we have a lot of poppies in the Netherlands. You can often find them just right next to the road, even right next to highways. You can find big fields of poppies. And if you zoom in, get the right angle, you can really photograph them just everywhere. It really doesn't matter. Tip number two, get low. I've said it before, but I will say it again. You always want to be on the eye height. Don't photograph from up to down because you don't get a separation from the background. So get low. And then an extra tip is to, well, you want to sit down. So bring something to sit down on so that you don't get dirty. And also use the flip screen of your camera because otherwise you're going to have to lie down everywhere in very weird angles. Tip number three, understand the light. Try it with one subject. Here we have a flower as an example here where there's a very soft light, very beautiful actually, very beautiful soft light. I like to photograph in these conditions, but also if you have the light from behind, for example, the same flower looks completely different, but also has a very nice effect. It's more silhouette. So experiment with it and see which angle has the best light. One extra tip for that, you can bring an umbrella to basically block the direct sunlight and get a very smooth and soft light on the subject. Then tip number four, the lens choice. So I usually use a little bit of a longer lens. So I sometimes even use the 100 to 400. And a trick then is you stand really far from the subject and you zoom in a lot. And that way you get a beautiful blurry background. So I have some example of a poppy flower here with some light behind. And I'm actually shooting at 400 millimeter. You get a beautiful blurry background, even though I'm not shooting at f2.8. So this is shot with a 100 to 400. It's not a super fast lens. This photo is shot with the same lens, but a completely different photo. So having a lens like that also gives you a lot of variety to photograph. Then the 7200 f2.8. I think a lot of people will have that with the f2.8 aperture. Of course, really soft, smooth background, so you can create a beautiful bokeh, beautiful backdrop with the 7200 f2.8. And again, I usually stand a little bit further away and shoot maybe at 150 or 200 millimeter at f2.8 to get that beautiful blurry effect. Here's another little bit of a creative shot with a 7200 f2.8. Lots of options with that lens. Then there's also the 7200 f4 macro. This is a lens that Sony has. Some other brands also have zoom lenses with macro. Also very useful for spring flowers. You can get closer to the tiny flowers and get a lot of beautiful close-ups. And then of course we have the real macro lenses. So I use a lot of times the 90 millimeter f2.8 macro to photograph flowers, especially close-ups. This way you can get super close and also shoot a lot of details of the flowers. So 90 millimeter macro, very good for flower photography. But if you don't have it, use a 7200 or a 100 to 400. Tip number five, background. Background is super important, maybe even more important than the subject, because those beautiful colors or bokeh in the background is really what makes the photo. So I often really look for the background a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and the background completely changes. So look for those beautiful colors or bokeh in your background. So here's an example of a very tiny snowdrop that I photographed here in the Netherlands. And you see that that beautiful color in the background is really what makes the photo stand out here. Then a similar subject, but here the background is very dark. The white little flowers with the dark background, it works very well. So really focus on your background. Make sure your background is clean, not too much going on, but sometimes you have these beautiful bokeh balls. So if you shoot on the wide open aperture, f2.8 or f4 even, you have these bokeh balls that define the lens, and sometimes they are very beautiful, even though they are a little bit busy, but you can get them really nice in your composition. Make sure that it's not touching too much the flower, but position them well in the background and you can get some very nice effects. Tip number 6, show the environment of the flower. I talked about getting close to the flower, but sometimes it's nice to go a little bit back and show more what is going on around the flower. Especially these tiny ones, sometimes there are big flowers around it. Here's a good example of a snowdrop that is actually in a crocus field. The crocuses are much bigger than this little snowdrop, and by framing the crocus flowers around the little snowdrop, you get a sense of space and environment. And here we see a little flower which was in a big tulip field, and I chose to frame the tulips also around it, so you can see how little this flower is in this big tulip field, and it creates a little bit more of a story. Tip number 7, get really close to the flower. And for that, of course, you need your macro lens. Here's a good example of a blossom tree. They're photographed really close, but we can even get closer than that. So here we have only these little stems, and it creates very artistic photos, mostly with the macro lens. So if you want to do stuff like that, get the macro lens. Here's another photo of a tulip. Where you can see the little dewdrops on the tulip, and it's especially beautiful in the morning when it's a little bit humid. You can get really abstract close-ups of the flowers with the dewdrops. And look at this, here we see a little raindrop actually on the tulip, reflecting a whole tulip field around. Absolutely beautiful, and I took an even closer shot of only that drop, and this is one of my favorite shots actually of those tulips. You can see the whole tulip field in this little drop. Really amazing stuff you can do with the macro lens, so try it out. Extra tip, bring a little perfume bottle, fill it with water, and you can just spray the flowers and simulate that dewdrop effect. Then tip number 8, you can use the flowers as framing. And while I talked mostly about macro lenses or long lenses, for this you need a little bit of a wider lens, because here we are photographing the flower trees. So we are using the flower trees as framing. Here's a good example of a windmill surrounded by this blossoming fruit trees. And here another example, same thing, fruit trees, frame around a subject. In this case, in the Netherlands, I often choose windmills, but get creative with that. You can even do it with portraits. Then we are almost at the end. Tip number 9, shoot handheld. And even though maybe some people will tell you otherwise, and it's not always the right way, I love to shoot handheld with a little bit of a faster shutter speed, because this allows me to get very tight spaces, very tight compositions, and I can very easily move a little bit to the left, move a little bit to the right, and I'm just so flexible, especially with all the tips I just gave you, with the very precise background. A few centimeters of difference already makes a big difference in the photo. So I often choose to shoot handheld also because I can get much lower to the ground shooting handheld. So if we see here, this photo, I'm actually very high. I'm holding the camera very high. I could not reach this with a tripod. And this photo is actually right on the ground. So also a tripod does not work here because the camera is basically on the ground. So you can get much more creative angles also by using the camera handheld. Then tip number 10, add some magic to your photos with editing. And what I often do, I reduce contrast to make the shots a little bit dreamier. Sometimes I also use some brushes to smoothen out the colors. And that works really well in this kind of photos. Post-processing, always an important step in my workflow. I also have a course where I actually treat some specific flower shots, some shots that you have seen in this video. Definitely check that out if you're interested. Well, that was a lot of tips. I want to give you one more before I close the video, and that is simply go out, enjoy spring, and take some photos. The flowers are really everywhere, so just go out. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe to the channel. Well, like the video, I wanted to say. And don't forget to ask some questions in the comments. And I hope to see you in another video.